Today marks World Refugee Day. While it aims to highlight the plight of migrants and asylum seekers, it's also an opportunity to celebrate their courage and tenacity. That's according to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi. One-third of the world's displaced citizens, more than 20 million people, are in Africa. The continent is also home to two of the largest refugee camps, Dadaab in Kenya and Bidi Bidi in northern Uganda. The UN Refugee Agency has warned that the South Sudan crisis is causing the world's fastest growing refugee population. Grandi says countries that welcome asylum seekers and migrants should be recognized.
On June 20, World Refugee Day, we honor the resilience and courage of more than 65 million people who have been forced to flee war, persecution and violence. But it is also a moment to recognize those communities and people around the world who receive refugees and the internally displaced in their midst, offering them a safe place and welcoming them in their schools, their workplaces, their societies.
Let's get more details on the world's refugees. CGTN's John Terret joins us live from New York. John, how does the United Nations break down the figures for refugees, asylum seekers and internally displaced people?
Hey, Panina. Well, the first thing to say, I think, is that the UN is really split into 5 key agencies. Now, the Security Council we report on all the time. And then after that, it's food and health and peacekeeping. And the one that we're talking about today, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. That's its rather cumbersome title. Now, the UN, for its own purposes, splits the issue of refugees into 3 different categories. Now, there are refugees. Those are people who are either living in camps or somewhere in another country, a foreign land, with absolutely no status whatsoever. There are asylum seekers, who are people who are on the way to gaining some kind of status in a country. And then there are the internally displaced, and the UN takes this extremely seriously. Now, there are 22 million refugees in the world now, we're told by the UN, 2.8 million asylum seekers, and 40 million people who are internally displaced. And that means that they've been forced to leave their home or their land by often long-running wars and conflicts. Now, where are they coming from in the main? According to the UN, it's Syria, Afghanistan, and as you said, Panina, just now, South Sudan, which Filippo Grandi, who is the High Commissioner for Refugees, says is the fastest growing refugee crisis in the world right now. Where are they going to? Well, countries, and here we'll refer to them all as refugees, like Turkey, Pakistan, Lebanon, Iran, and in Africa, Uganda and Ethiopia are taking them in. And of course, refugees are going elsewhere, but those countries are taking many, many hundreds of thousands of refugees, and they're often in very large camps. And in Ethiopia, I was reading an article the other day, which suggested that one of the best places in the world to be a refugee is Ethiopia. They get very well treated there. They're given money and land, and little villages are springing up where there once weren't any, and they're entirely made up of refugees. Felina?
So, John, what is the UN calling on the world to do?
Well, the UN is telling us that 65.6 million refugees in the world in 2016, up 300,000 on 2015, but down a lot on the period 2014 to 2015, when in fact it increased by something like 5 million. Now, Filippo Grandi, who is the High Commissioner, has been speaking here in New York. We heard from him at the top of the show. He's now been surpassed, I suppose, by the Secretary General, who of course is a former head of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres. He's been speaking here in the briefing room at United Nations headquarters today, and he laid out 5 points that he would like to see the world contribute to regarding refugees, and I'll just read them off for you. Number 1 is for countries to re-establish protection for refugees if they have started to decline, like the United States, for example. He was asked directly. He said the US has a huge role to play. I've told them that, meaning the Trump administration. And also he said that he wants the United States to go back to accepting the level of refugees that it was accepting 2 or 3 years ago. He also called for people to understand that the resolution to this will ultimately be political. He called for an increase in humanitarian support. He called for an increase in help for countries that are taking refugees, like Uganda and Ethiopia, and countries in the Middle East like Lebanon, where 1/3 of the population is a refugee. And he also called for respect for international law, so that those who are carrying out war crimes in these conflicts where people are being displaced get brought to justice. Panina?
All right, let's leave it there for now. John, thank you for joining us. John Terret live for us there in New York.